Hi everyone, my name is Robert. Welcome back to my channel. I am here today to do a tag for Tag Tuesday, and I'm going to do the My Neck of the Woods tag. This was originated not too terribly long ago by Kelly of Books I'm Not Reading, and then I was tagged by my friend Jasmine of Jasmine Reads, and I'll put both of their versions of this tag in the description box for you to check those out and for you to jump on board as well. They're not really questions, but the first topic is that you can define your neck of the woods any way you want. And for me, I have just recently moved back to the state of North Carolina after being gone for 3 years. And before that, I lived in North Carolina for roughly 15 years. So I'm not a North Carolina native. I grew up in a military family, so I moved a great deal. And I can't really call any one place as my hometown, but I realize by a pretty significant margin that I've lived in North Carolina longer than I've lived anywhere else. And so I'm going to call North Carolina my neck of the woods for the purposes of this video. Plus, it gave me a good chance to do a little bit of background research on North Carolina authors. This area has a huge literary tradition. For those of you that don't know, North Carolina is really 3 separate and very different regions within one state. If you start on the East Coast, in the coastal plain region, you've got the Outer Banks, you've got the marshes and the sounds that were a feature in the book I mentioned to you in a couple of my recent reads, Delia Owens' novel Where the Crawdads Sing. Then the middle of the state, the Piedmont, is kind of the transition between that coastal area and the western part of the state, which is mountains. Asheville is in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Great Smoky Mountains are there as well. So that range of the Appalachians. So we have 3 pretty distinct geographic regions, and that also affects some of the writing that you'll see from authors in the state of North Carolina. I found right away when I was starting to do my research, I found a cute little article on Culture Trip, which just went through and outlined 10 literary icons from the state of North Carolina. So I thought I would just give you a brief summary of those 10. And then as I continue to learn more about North Carolina, who knows, I may do another version of this tag with more authors, because there are a lot of them that I won't mention today that are mention worthy from this state. The first one is Thomas Wolfe. He's often considered the most important literary figure from North Carolina. He lived in Asheville, which is in the western part in the mountains. And a lot of his contemporaries and even some of the later critics have tried to place Thomas Wolfe. This is not Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe. This is Thomas Wolfe. They've tried to put him in the same category as writers like William Faulkner, Charles Dickens, even Dostoevsky. I've read one of his novels, his most famous, Homeward Angel, and I don't see him in that category at all. In fact, I read this at a time when I was under huge stress. I was having to read this as one of the books for my PhD exams, and so I had to read it very quickly. I was essentially reading a book a day for a full year to get all the reading done for that exam. And I found this bloated and long-winded and self-indulgent. He loves lists, and it was like reading a bunch of his lists, and I just didn't care for it much. But it's his most famous novel, and it kind of sets him into the category of novelists who are autobiographical. That's very popular today. When he was writing it, it wasn't as popular. And so he's an autobiographical novelist, and Homeward Angel kind of recounts his youth, his coming of age. Now, he did die very young. He died at age 38 of tuberculosis and only wrote 4 books, and the last 2 of them were actually published posthumously. But it's kind of impossible to talk about North Carolina writers without talking about Thomas Wolfe. The second writer isn't a novelist, but rather a short story writer, known as O. Henry. His real name was William Sidney Porter, grew up in North Carolina. He had a pretty interesting youth. He was up against embezzlement charges. He fled to Honduras to avoid a stint in jail, ended up actually spending 3 years in prison. While he was there, he served as the nighttime pharmacist. But then after all of that, he moves to New York and he starts beginning to publish some of his short stories that are really popular because they're partly funny, but they're partly known for these amazing twists of plot at the end. Perhaps the most famous of his is The Gift of the Magi, which I've taught to 8th graders before. A wonderful, ironic story. And so he's kind of a household name. There are prizes named after him and so on. He's spawned a bunch of popular retellings and parodies even in popular culture. He actually was the one who termed the phrase Banana Republic during his time in Honduras when he was talking about Latin American countries with somewhat shaky governments. Not that that's at all relevant today here in our country, but O. Henry is sort of a North Carolina favorite son too. This third author, everybody knows, but he's not a novelist. He's technically a nonfiction writer, although there's some question about how accurate his stories are and whether they shouldn't rather be cast as fiction. And that, of course, is David Sedaris. He grew up in the suburbs of Raleigh, and in some of his earlier works, he talks a lot about what life in North Carolina was like, especially for a young gay man and a very conservative family. And this gets exaggerated in a lot of his writing, and he's been at the center of a lot of heated discussions about whether his writing is really true, whether it's nonfiction, whether it's fiction. I don't really care. I find it hilarious. If you don't know Sedaris, you should read some, but better than reading some, you should do some on audio, because when he reads his own essays, he has a very distinctive voice. And when he reads those essays, they become 3 times as funny the way he reads them. He did a PBS giveaway disc many years ago from Carnegie Hall that was just absolutely a riot. But his audiobooks of his published essays are good too. He lives now, I believe he's in England now. He lived in France for a while, and he has a lot of stories about France, and now he has stories about England. But every once in a while, he'll still bring back a story about North Carolina. The fourth author is Charles Frazier. Not too many writers get their very first novel to become immediate bestsellers and then get adapted into Oscar-winning films. But that's what happened with Frazier's Cold Mountain when he wrote it in 1997. It talks about the Confederate War and a soldier making his way back home through the North Carolina mountains after being injured in the Civil War. And the idea came from a family story for Frazier. He's published novels since then, and all of them are set in the Appalachians. And so it's not unlikely that his future work will have a similar regional cast to it. I haven't read his brand new one that just came out this year, Verena. But I think it's a Civil War story as well, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's set in the same region. The next author is another novelist, Reynolds Price. And I've only read a little bit of Price. And in fact, I was recently, when I was still doing my read-alongs, One of his novels, Kate Vaden, was the next one up in my 20th century read-along list. He was born in Macon, North Carolina during the Great Depression, and he graduated from Duke right here in Durham. Eventually, he came back to Durham to teach after doing a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. While he was at Oxford, he developed some friendships with some really important British writers, including people like W.H. Auden. And his work, like most of the people on this list, is really rooted in Southern heritage. He was also a great biblical scholar, and this was one of the focuses of his teaching at Duke. He was rendered paralyzed from the waist down after a bout with spinal cancer in the 1980s, but after that was one of his most prolific phases as a writer before he died in 2011. So I'm looking forward to reading Kate Vaden and seeing how his Southern heritage roots show up in that novel as well. The next novelist is a woman that I met once at a book signing here in North Carolina. Back when some of you may have known, many years ago, I had a small bookstore in North Carolina, and I met Lee Smith at a book signing and then tried to get her to come to my store, but the dates never worked out. But she was born in the Appalachian Mountains, but in Virginia, but she is sent to come to play a really large role in the writing community in North Carolina, partly because she does make herself so available to the public. And she's always trying to answer everybody's questions about writing that she possibly can. She's written a lot of novels. She's written novellas, short story collections, and a lot of the themes that touch on her connection to the state of North Carolina. And she taught for many years at NC State in Raleigh. And at least the last time I looked, she was living in Hillsborough, which is a local community here in the area too. So if you haven't tried Lee Smith, a great Southern voice to try. The next writer is another connection to Duke, and it's a nonfiction writer. Timothy Tyson came of age during the civil rights movement in North Carolina, where race has always been a really important issue. And Tyson witnessed a racially charged episode that would go on to shape the direction of his life. In 1970, a young black man in his town of Oxford, North Carolina, was killed by a group of whites. And then they were then acquitted by an all-white jury. And Tyson wrote an account of this and his memoir in a pretty famous book, Blood Done Sign My Name. And he was a historian and, as I mentioned, a professor at Duke, and he devotes a lot of his time and energy to both the study of history and the lingering issues surrounding race and segregation in North Carolina and the South in general. So if you're looking for a good nonfiction read for Nonfiction November, Blood Done Sign My Name might be one to look at. Another novelist with ties to the area is Allan Gurganus, who hails from Rocky Mount, which is one of the eastern cities in North Carolina. His debut novel in 1989 kind of launched him into the national discussion. The Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All, one of those long, baggy titles. Not surprisingly, given the title, he's often concerned himself deeply with politics. And he co-founded a group called Writers Against Jesse Helms. If those of you who are of a certain age remember that Jesse Helms was a senator from North Carolina, notable for his unfailing racism, right to the end. Horrible human being. Gurganus was a Vietnam vet himself, and he's spoken out at the time against the war in Iraq. And so he's been taught and studied at some of the nation's most distinguished writing faculties, including the Iowa Writers Workshop. This next one is a little controversial. Orson Scott Card is either a YA writer or a science fiction writer or both, but his book Ender's Game threw him into the national spotlight. Its sequel, too, Speaker for the Dead, which I have not read. I have read Ender's Game, won the 2 top awards for science fiction in 1985 and then 1986, respectively. And he's the first writer to ever win them both in successive years. He's written a lot more science fiction since then, and he's also tried his hand with historical fiction and alternative histories. He's from Greensboro. And like several of the other writers on this list, he's put his home state very much into his work. But there are stories, and they've been going around forever, of what an awful individual he actually is. And so I've only read Ender's Game, and I've decided I'm not going to read any more of his work. I don't want to support people that I find that reprehensible. But there's no denying he is an important figure in science fiction, and he is from Greensboro, which is about an hour from here. I'm in Durham, if you don't know. The last one on this list, and I could easily extend this list to 20 or 30, is a YA author. And I don't read YA much anymore. I read quite a bit of it when I was doing a short stint teaching 8th grade, because that was the kind of books that 13 and 14-year-olds were getting into. So I read a lot to know what they wanted to read. But the minute I stopped teaching that grade level and moved back to teaching seniors, I stopped with YA. And so I've never read a book by her, but Sarah Dessen is a famous YA novelist who also lives in North Carolina. Her books are often put in the same category as some of the authors that were mentioned in the first part of this list. But she's writing touching accounts of teenage girls, and a lot of girls now get through challenging years reading Sarah Dessen's books because she's talking about the issues that they feel that they're facing. She was born on the outskirts of Chicago. So she's not a native of North Carolina, but she moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is 8 miles from me, when she was very young. And she stayed near her second hometown for much of the rest of her life. Her own memories from high school often inform her writing, as does the place that she's experienced them. So that's a quick wrap up of 10 North Carolina writers. I may do some research and add to this in another video, because there are so many people with ties to North Carolina, and I didn't even get into books that were set in North Carolina necessarily, like Where the Crawdads Sing. But thank you, Kelly, for starting this tag. It's fun to see what people dig up about in their own neck of the woods, and I'd love to see more people doing this. It says to tag 3 people, so I'm not sure who's done this and who hasn't. So if I've tagged you and you've already done it, my apologies for the duplication. But I'd like to see Kate from the novel Nomad do this. She's from Australia, and I don't know that much about Australia. I'd like to learn more. And I'm going to tag Jacqueline from 6 Minutes for Me, who may have done this. She's also Australian, but now she's been transplanted to Houston, Texas. So she might choose either one to look into if she does this video. And then let's see, who else lives in a really interesting location? Maybe Madison from, is it The Wayward Reader, I think is the title of her channel. She's from Maryland, but she lives now in Alaska. And so I'm always interested in learning more about other places. So maybe Alaska next. Okay, everybody, I'll talk to you again later this week. And until then, I hope your week is a great one. Bye-bye.